The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this IIBA UK webinar. My name's Adrian Reid, and I'm President at IIBA UK. And we're really fortunate this evening to be joined by Sarah Coleman, who's a Director at Business Evolution, and she's going to be talking to us about influencing without authority. Now, I don't know about you, but when I saw the title of this webinar, it really resonated with me, because influencing without authority is something we probably do as business analysts every day of our working lives. Now, I was first introduced to Sarah through the 2013 book Business Analysts and Leadership, Influencing Change, where Sarah wrote a chapter about power and politics. And I'm sure we're all going to be very interested to hear what Sarah has to say this evening about influencing without authority. So without further ado, Sarah, over to you.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you to Adrian for the invitation to talk this evening about influencing without authority. And I think the first question is really about, why should I be interested in this at all? Because as business analysts, we often have the responsibility and accountability to do things and to make things happen that we don't always have direct control over. For example, by virtue of a seniority or line authority. And a lot of our energy during the working day is spent trying to make things happen and get things done for ourselves in order to meet expectations and deadlines, or on behalf of other people so that they can meet expectations and deadlines. But most of the important decisions in organizations involve the allocation of scarce resources. And we're talking here about personnel or expertise, budget, technology, even capital equipment. And with competing requirements for these resources, organizations have to decide how they allocate them, for better or for worse. And as a result, decision processes often involve bargaining and negotiating, collaboration and jockeying for position by many different self-interested groups, even within a single organization. Most decisions about the allocation of resources, how conflict is resolved, how cooperation and collaboration is supported, and where the organization should head, are not done at formal department or board meetings. The lobbying conversations are done outside these meetings, and these impact and influence decisions long before individuals actually walk into a room and take a vote. So I would suggest that the most effective business analysts are those who recognize they need to complement the technical side of their role with effective behaviors and soft skills. They need to be able to work confidently outside their formal areas of authority, move easily across areas of the organization, and build influence and support at all levels of the organization, and that's right from the C-suite down to the operational levels. So how can you work effectively under such circumstances to get things done, either for yourself, in order to meet expectations and deadlines, or for your team? And being able to influence effectively is one of a range of abilities which is very useful. So influence really comes under the heading of organizational intelligence. Although you might have the accountability and responsibility to produce results, you can't rely exclusively on a formal hierarchical position. And this obviously puts a premium on you being able to make sense of the power bases, the politics, the networks, and the relationships within your own organization and maybe within other organizations. So being organization intelligent is not just about being able to identify and target support and commitment. It's also about understanding how decisions are made, who the gatekeepers are, who has access to resources we need, and indeed, even when we are the target of politics and power ourselves. So what about me? Who am I? A little bit about my background so you can understand my own interest in influence and organizational intelligence. My early career was as a software developer, business analyst, project manager and program director, and that's a 30-year career, and I've had the great fortune to be able to work across many industry sectors in the UK and abroad. And as Adrian said in his introduction, I wrote the chapter enabled Dealing with Power and Politics in Business Analysis and Leadership, which was edited by Penny Pullen and James Archer, and which was published by Code and Page last year. I've had a long interest in how people in organisations succeed in the work they do, especially when they're not able to depend on hierarchical authority, and how they manage to move easily across the organisation and get things done. So having worked as a business analyst and as a project program portfolio manager during my own career, I very rapidly came to the conclusion that in order for these types of roles to work successfully, you have to be able to work across functions and teams and groups, as well as working up and down the levels of hierarchy, and do all of this, of course, with ease and confidence. So you'll begin to recognize why, as a business analyst who's a real asset to your organization, you need to develop that awareness and skill in influencing to help develop that ability to become aware of politics and the organization and power bases of the groups you'll need to influence and carry with you. So simply put, we need to do things on a daily basis that we can't necessarily accomplish by ourselves. And being able to influence is absolute key to this. So the business analyst 6 lookings represents the different facets of a business analyst role. And looking upwards and looking outwards, you're actually managing up towards your own line managers, perhaps your sponsor, your governance team, and getting their commitment and engagement. And looking outwards, you're looking to the client, the end users, and any external stakeholders, again to make sure that the project or the piece of work meets their expectations. And then looking backwards, you're looking at progress, how that actually works. What control systems, measurement systems, performance measurement systems are you using? And looking forward, you're always planning and anticipating and understanding what needs to happen next and what the risks are. But also equally, you're looking inwards. You're managing yourself, you're reflecting on what's happened and what needs to happen, and you're constantly reviewing your own performance, as well as looking downwards and managing your team and reflecting on their performance and helping and supporting them as well. And that's across disciplines, perhaps across divisions if it's a large organization, even across countries and cultures as well. So what is influence? There is no single agreed definition of influence, but a few of the suggestions I've come across when I've been doing my own research into this are these. It's the ability to alter or sway an individual or a group's thoughts, beliefs, or actions. Or it could be capacity to have an effect on the behavior and the development of something or someone. Or as it might even be the psychology of persuasion, which has come up very recently as well. Note here language. It's a very neutral tone. There's no particular indication of ethics or the right or wrong of a situation, no indication of whether this is for self-serving purposes only, or perhaps for the greater good of the team, the project or the organization. In other words, there's actually no context here for the ethical application of influence. So have a think about a person who has a particular influence with your own organization. What is it that allows them to have that influence? It's not the same as positional power. Just because someone is influential, it doesn't necessarily mean they have the hierarchical power and authority. Not everyone who has hierarchical power and authority has the ability to influence. And key influences in organizations are often those that people trust and go to talk to when they have a question, perhaps a problem, or actually they just need to talk things out or a shoulder to cry on. You find them at all levels of an organization and across all functions and teams. So I'm going to ask you a question about your ability to influence at the moment. How would you describe your ability to influence successfully? This is going to be a rhetorical question. It's not a poll, so we're going to look at levels 1 to 5. Level 1 being, what did you say influence is again? Level 2 is, I do understand what influence is, but actually everybody else seems to do it better than I do. Or perhaps you're a level 3. I look at the people and the situation and I make my plans from there. And sometimes it even works. Stepping up again to level 4, I successfully use influencing skills as an integral part of my own role. Or perhaps you're level 5. Actually, I run the organisation using influence. It's just that no one else realises this. So where are you on that spectrum? How would you describe yourself at the moment and your own ability to influence successfully? I was listening to Deborah Paul's presentation in May this year, one of the IIBA webinars, and she talked through the various waves of business analysis and the trends. And she talked first of all about how it was originally a bridging role between perhaps IT and business. And she talked then about the second trend and wave, which was really about challenging, looking more towards strategy execution, problem solving. And then she talked about the third wave as advising. And this is really working across the organisation, looking at value streams, advising organisations on the best way that they can spend their money, getting value for money. She talked about business analysts progressively moving up the value chain to influence decisions, investments and outcomes. And of course, this all depends on the organisational context, and as you're probably well aware, not all organisations are seeing business analysts working at those levels, or indeed not all organisations welcome our input at that kind of level. So this is about delivering value, getting the best outcomes for the organisation. And part of that ability to deliver value and best outcomes, I'd suggest, is the ability to influence and to develop that organisational intelligence. More than anyone, Daniel Goleman's work has influenced the way we think about emotional and traditional intelligence. His work's been around now for the best part of 30 years, but his original work and research into psychology and neuroscience gave us some insight into two minds, the rational and the emotional. And he talks about self-awareness as the ability to recognize and understand your moods, emotions and drives, as well as their effect on others. And it's this effect on others that is key to influence that we're really interested in here. And a lot of the research and publication around influence is aimed at salespeople to help them move their own prospective customers to commit to buy. But here we're shifting the focus a little to understand how to do this within the context of business analysis. So Daniel Goleman suggests that emotional entrainment is one of the central tenets for influence. And what he actually means by that is being persuasive and managing by sensing emotions and responding carefully. So being very sensitive to what's going on and finding just the right appeal for a given situation, knowing how to build buy-in. So whereas intelligence, IQ, generally refers to the mental abilities for collecting, for handling, analysing and reasoning in relation to information, EQ, or emotional quotient, focuses on your ability to recognise your own behaviours, moods and thoughts. But even more important, it's the ability to manage them in a range of different situations, to shape your interactions and your relationships with others within a particular context. So who and what influences you? Here's a photo of who was, at the time, arguably the most influential person in the world. And then there's G.W. Bush, who was at the same time President of the United States of America. So who is the most influential person in the photo? Some people believe it's George Bush because he had the positional power and authority, and others believe it's the baby because the baby can make or break the photo opportunity with George Bush. In fact, I'd argue that the most influential person in the photo is the person who's holding the baby. And you can see their hands just in the lower right-hand part of the photo. I'd argue this is the person who will decide, now that the baby is crying, whether to push the baby onto George Bush and watch him become extremely uncomfortable with the situation, or whether to take the baby away from George Bush and spare him his blushes. So what do you think? So why is influence so important to business analysts and the way we work today? This is really about the traditional way in which we've worked and the new reality. It isn't something that's particularly new to the business analysis or even the project management communities, because we've always had to be able to move effortlessly, seamlessly across organizations, that's across teams and functions and departments, even locations, as well as up and down the traditional hierarchies in order to become effective. But in the new reality, the old crutch of hierarchy is replaced. We need to make relationships and use influence and work through others to get things done. We have to learn to operate without hierarchy, which has traditionally given people their own power base. So this effectively means that to be highly effective, our technical skills in business analysis need to be augmented by those softer skills of networking, collaboration. It really isn't enough anymore to expect just the technical knowledge to get us to where we need to be. And more emphasis is really being placed on collaboration and matrix working across functions and divisions. Matrix working, multifunctional, multi-located teams don't really hold any surprises for us where we've worked for many years in project environments, but it certainly does highlight the needs to build relationships, to exercise influence and collaboration. So this gentleman is Dale Carnegie. He first published his work on how to win friends and influence people in 1936, and it's pretty much continued to be an influential text and business bestseller ever since. And although Dale Carnegie died in 1955, his work continues to influence new generations. It continues to be updated, and one of the most recent publications is How to Win Friends and Influence People in the Digital Age, so keeping relevant to modern times. So what he said all those years ago, and I still believe it holds true today, is that influencing skills are generally associated with workplace success. He talked about emphasizing the people skills, and these are not, it's not rocket science. They're very modest aims here, and it's a bit like stating the blindingly obvious, but he talked about three main areas: helping people to like us. And some of these things are just as basic as showing interest, remembering somebody's name, smiling, listening to them as well as letting them talk. Winning people over, so understanding their perception, where they're coming from, perhaps what's important to them. And then finally, amazingly, is avoid offending them. So instead of command and control, it's asking questions, looking for consensus, understanding why. So we've talked about the fact that influence is practiced by being persuasive and managing the emotions of others. It's done by sensing the emotion and responding appropriately so that you can move a conversation or a meeting towards what you want to happen. And when we talk about influencing stakeholders, for example, in business analysis or project management, it's a fairly neutral thing. There's an objective or a goal, and your role is to enable it to be achieved. But this still means that influence can be positive or it can be negative. Good influencers have the ability to impress without strong force. They appeal to reason and to rational decisions. Focus here is really on interpersonal skills, relationship building. But there's also negative or coercive influence, and this can use manipulation, intimidation, or embarrassment. And then, again, there's influence with integrity. So how do you influence with integrity? Well, this is about sometimes appealing to values. So you might have specific beliefs about what's good and bad, important or unimportant, and by expressing these values you might be able to capture interest and goodwill. Your values touch according others and your conviction. You perhaps invoke respect for these. You attract others by appealing to their moral sense. And visioning. How can you influence with integrity via visioning? Well, you create the pictures of a desirable future. The nirvana of what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to make happen. And by this you're actually bringing ideas, vision, meaning, direction to other people's thinking. And you're giving them an understanding of what could happen. You're an architect of the future here, and you attract others by providing a very, very positive picture. So then the questions are around, how can I improve my own ability to influence? And here it's about the people and the relationships. So in the first instance, here it's about reciprocity. And reciprocity is often called the first weapon of influence. It's about helping others to get to their goals. And in doing this, you yourself create what's called reciprocity. I do a favour for you, you do a favour for me. We scratch each other's backs. And one of the major driving forces, as they say, behind reciprocity is fulfilling debt. And I'm not talking about financial debt here. I'm talking about behaviour and favours. And we're told it's human nature to want to repay debt. If we receive a gift or a favour from someone, we feel compelled to return that act. And some people feel that they're extremely obliged to give back to others the type of behaviour or service which they received first. If a colleague does you a favour, then you owe that colleague a favour. And put bluntly, people are more likely to say yes to those people that they owe. And so the key is to be the first person to give, to make it relevant, to make it personal, and also perhaps unexpected. How else can I improve it? Well, it's identifying and finding the right people to influence. So here they are. They might even be key people outside the organisation, perhaps a supplier or a partner. And within an organisation, you have a huge array of potential stakeholders. So how do you find these people? And how do you work with them and cultivate those relationships? Well, do network and do build those strong, robust relationships, because people prefer to say yes to the people they like. And this is going back again to the Dale Carnegie ideas. People like us when we help them, so cooperate and collaborate. And actively review and manage your relationships, just like the stakeholder mapping and engagement that you probably already do within your role. You'll know that you just don't do this once and assume it'll remain constant. People move in and out of roles. They get promoted, they move sideways, sometimes they move out of the organisation altogether, and others move in. Relationships and your ability to influence these effectively are dynamic, not static. They're fluid, they can be redefined, and as such they need review, they need reappraisal and renegotiation. So I have a question. Who are the right people that you need to influence? And I ask about the right people because you need to focus on the people who matter, rather than using a scattergun approach or pin your hopes on someone who doesn't quite have the power or authority you need. It might be someone you don't know, or even somebody you don't like, but find a way to get to them, even if it's through someone else. Another way, here we've got a picture of Professor Stephen Hawking, and he's an authority by virtue of his expertise. So this is really around developing your authority and your expertise. And you can do this in a number of ways. But people follow the lead of credible, knowledgeable experts. So you're more likely to be able to influence if you have authority and expertise. And I'm not talking about hierarchical authority here. I'm talking about authority in the sense of knowing what you're talking about and being credible. So identify, develop your authority and expertise. Don't just leave it to chance, but actively plan it and make it work for you. So there are 6 aspects there. And one of them is about expert, being knowledgeable, having experience and judgment, the technical ability to do what you do. And these are some of your very basic technical tools that you use and work with every day. Referent, well, that relates to wanting to be liked, or somebody wanting to be associated with you because they value what you bring in any particular way. And information, perhaps you possess or you have access to particular or necessary information that others are interested in. And those 3 are really about personal influence. What can you personally bring to the party? The remainder are really about positional influence by virtue perhaps of your position in the organization. So it's about connection, who you know, reward. Are you able to reward desirable behavior in others? It might be coercive. Are you able to punish or sanction others within your team perhaps? And process, control over methods of the way that things are done, production or analysis. And finally, how can I improve my ability to influence? Well, talking about style here. The final point is about proving your ability to influence through style. So one of them might be your own personal influencing style. Can you understand it? How well do you influence? Do you understand how you influence and why it works for you? Perhaps it's about your personal style in relation to your image and how people perceive you. And maybe it's also about being able to identify your own key influences at work and elsewhere, and you watch them at work. Looking at role models is a great way to understand how they do what they do so well. What can you use that they do as part of your own techniques? We all use and need role models to help us understand how to improve what we do ourselves. So what's your influencing style? We all typically have a preferred or a natural style of doing things, which is really a way that's comfortable for us. But you might want to consider a question I have. Is the best style to have one that you're comfortable with, or one that lands well with whoever you're talking to? And I ask this because if you only ever stick to one style, you'll only get the best out of a particular situation or context. If you're able to flex your style, well, that's being able to use more than one style of influence according to the person on the receiving end, or according to a particular situation or context. And you'll probably find that you're even more successful if you're able to do that. And the table you're looking at looks at 5 different types of influencing style: asserting, convincing, negotiating, bridging, and inspiring. And each one of those is defined by specific areas. So which one are you? Which one do you favour most? What's your preferred style there? And can you look at other ones as well? Because we often have one single preferred style, but we also have a secondary style too that we use. So how will you choose to influence? So here's the question. Are you self-serving, or are you a team player? Perhaps a little of both, to be honest, because after all, we're never completely altruistic. So talking about the old crutch of hierarchy is replaced today by the ability to make relationships and to get results through others. But as business analysts, we don't always enjoy having to negotiate, to persuade, to influence, to barter for resources which actually we think we should have, which are needed for our team or a project. And we often resent the time used to do this, because we could use this time for other more constructive purposes. But on the assumption that this is going to happen regardless of what we personally want, we need to be able to find and develop appropriate tools and techniques to help us do this effectively. And I talk to people sometimes who are a little bit alarmed and worried about having the responsibility and the commitment that comes with influence. If you choose not to influence, then possibly somebody will fill that gap for you, and not necessarily to your own team or project or your own benefit. So start looking at what you're able to influence and how you're able to do this. If you look at influence as the capacity to mobilize people and resources to get things done, then you'll start to recognize it as a useful tool, something that you can effectively put into your tool and technique box as a business analyst. And I also do believe that your team or project will actually benefit from your ability to influence well. So a final word, how far do you actually want to go? And this is about career planning, because being able to influence doesn't just help you execute your role well, but it also helps you in your own career progression. Technical and commercial knowledge are hygiene factors. These are the professional things that you have to do, to learn, to experience in order to get where you are, to get you as far as you've got. But these are what they call the entry-level requirements for senior positions. Whether you choose to continue in the business analysis expert function or perhaps make a move into a more general executive position. Being an expert business analyst and understanding the business is certainly important, but the next step up to senior and board level is often a little different. This is about building strong relationships at all levels, becoming organizationally intelligent, identifying your influencing skills, creating your personal brand, creating trust and credibility. And these are all often regarded as signs of personal and professional maturity. It's where sitting down to take a long, hard look at your own level of influence and organizational intelligence comes into play. And you as business analysts are well placed to elevate yourselves into different roles. By virtue of the fact that you work across the organization, you're able to build a good holistic and systemic view of the organization and how the individual parts work together as a whole. And frankly, if you are good at influencing, you'll probably have people on the lookout on your behalf for more senior and for more interesting roles. So ladies and gentlemen, it's been my pleasure to talk to you about influencing without authority and developing organizational intelligence. My name is Sarah Coleman, and thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand back to Adrian now.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for a very interesting and thought-provoking webinar and presentation. Sarah, if you could just cycle back to the previous slide, because we've got a little while for questions now, and we've got a few questions in already. But if you are on the webinar, if you'd like to ask Sarah any questions, please do type your questions into the question box, and we will cover as many questions as we can during the time we have left. So do type any questions you have through, and we will do what we can to answer them. So Sarah, our first question is around emotional intelligence, and it's a really interesting question, which is what can we actually do to become more emotionally intelligent ourselves as business analysts?
That's a wonderful question, and I like that very much. And I would suggest that out of the different facets that Daniel Goleman talks about, there are two areas that might be particularly of interest here. One is about self-awareness, and because influencing depends so much on personal social skills, being aware of how you relate to people and your impact on people, and also being aware of the points at which you become happy or sad or stressed or angry, is actually a really great gift to be able to understand, because this is the basis for everything else that's going to happen about social awareness and everything else that actually is built on top of that.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just looking through the questions, Sarah, that we have. Our next question, again, it's what are the best techniques for influencing someone slightly more senior than you who clearly demonstrates coercive influencing traits? So probably a situation many of us will identify with. Any tips for that one, Sarah?
Thank you for that one. It's unfortunately, and I have to say unfortunately, it is not unusual, even in this time and space. One of the first things they talk about is understanding where this other person comes from. So I'd go back to the Dale Carnegie ideas about listening to other people and what is important to them. It's entirely possible and not unusual that people who choose to command and control are under a great deal of stress themselves. And there's something out there called the imposter syndrome. I don't know if you've heard about it or you've come across it before. And it's often where people find themselves promoted to a position where they think, I'm going to be found out at any minute, I really can't do this. And when people get under stress, they typically do revert to command and control. So it's entirely possible that the person you're talking about is under this kind of stress and feels that the only way they can protect their position is actually behaving in this manner. So number one is actually find out what's going on with them, and you can do that by gentle probing, even to the extent of taking them out and having a coffee with them, or inviting them to lunch, and make it a neutral and unthreatening area. Getting them to talk about themselves a bit, where they're coming from, what their background is, what's important to them, what they're being tasked with from their own line management as well is often a very interesting question to ask, and you'd be often quite surprised by the answer. And making it very, very clear that you're there to support them and help them, not just, and you appreciate actually being delegated to and not being micromanaged. I think there is a conversation there about how you and how your manager work best together. This is about, well, if you remember back to the 6 lookings, it's about being able to manage upwards as well as them being able to manage downwards. So there is a conversation there to be had about, and perhaps it can be introduced by, how do you like to work? What do you want to see from me? What do I need to do to prove to you I can be trusted? So some of those very direct questions can take people back, but actually make them think quite a bit about what they want to happen.
Okay, so direct questions and building empathy and understanding the world that particular stakeholder's in as well.
Yes.
Okay, you mentioned 6 lookings there. We've got a specific question around 6 lookings, and the question is, would you say it's correct? The asker asks, is it correct for me to say that looking upwards mainly involves influencing with integrity?
I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that. Often when people talk about influencing, sometimes it has a very negative connotation. So I've tried to talk about what is positive and what is negative, and the ethical aspects of influencing as well. I'd like to think the answer is yes, but I'd be very interested to hear what the actual situation is where you think that perhaps acting with or influencing positively or with integrity isn't necessarily going to work.
Okay. So if the asker of that question has any follow-ups, then perhaps they can type those in as well.
That would be interesting. Yes.
Indeed, indeed. Another really interesting question that I think many people on the line will be thinking as well, which is, what advice would you give for influencing remotely, for non-face-to-face interactions? And of course, I'm sure many of us are dealing with web conferencing and audio conferencing. Any tips for that?
Yeah. That's a really good question, especially in today's organizations that are often, they're multi-site. They can be multi-site locally, regionally, nationally, and of course the big multi-corporate, multinational corporates are over, not just over continents, but over different cultures as well, and that does really add another dimension to this. People relate to people better if they've actually managed to have some face-to-face time, even if it's just an initial meeting, and thereafter are meetings or conference calls at arm's length. Even managing to get video conferencing going, if possible, helps to add, because it's in this day and age where you've got email. It's very easy to dash off an email that's directive and sounds commanding, rather than acknowledging people's requests and acknowledging their issues. So I would always recommend, and I believe and I totally understand that in some cases this is not possible, but if at all possible, if you've got a project and you are up there front and you can help to shape the budget and the scope for it, to get money in the budget to actually start to build the team and assemble the team in such a way that it's at some point you get face-to-face.
Okay,
because
fantastic.
It really will work for you.
Absolutely, yes.
The other aspect. Sorry, Adrian, the other aspect as well is to make sure that when you do have communication, it's regular communication and it's meaningful communication. So it's not just about talking to somebody and then leaving it 3 months and coming back again. It's being able to keep that channel open and those communications going.
Yes, absolutely. Keep the lines open and keep talking. Okay, we have another question now. It sort of links to a previous question about EQ and emotional intelligence, and it's probably slightly outside the scope of what we're talking about here, but interesting nevertheless. And the question is, what if others around us aren't emotionally intelligent?
Mm-hmm. Oh yes. Yep. Well, my immediate response is, because others around you are not emotionally intelligent, that doesn't stop you from being emotionally intelligent, which somebody you might think is a facetious answer, but actually isn't. A lot of who you are and what you do, you are a role model in your own right. And other people will be looking at you and seeing what you do, not just members of your team at more junior levels, but your peers and your managers too. They will be looking at you and seeing what you do. And if you get better results because you're more emotionally aware, emotionally intelligent, then actually somebody may well be learning off you. You could also offer to be a mentor to people as well, because that will help shape them and their behaviours and their outlook. You could talk about, if you've got a team there, you might talk about team building and getting away for a day and having some very direct conversations. Sometimes organisations put together 360 appraisals, which all help to give feedback to individuals about their behaviours and about their attitudes and about the way they work. So it can work in a number of different ways, but I would always say, just because somebody else is being a little bit of a prat, it doesn't stop you from doing the right thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, fantastic. We have another question now, which is possibly on a slightly sensitive topic, so I'm going to paraphrase the question because I think it's got some useful insight in there. And the question is around cultural contexts where perhaps there's a certain expectation that someone who is older or younger might not have as much influence, or indeed that someone of a particular gender isn't or shouldn't have so much influence. And I think the gist that the gist of the question is that those sort of ageism and sexism type situations can exist, and is there a way of surmounting them? Is there a way of influencing even if the cultural context is against an individual because of their age or their gender or any other attribute of them?
Okay. There are a number of fronts on which you can influence within an organization. One of the most obvious is being influential in your workplace, in your own function. But that doesn't stop you from also building influence with your networks. So building networks within the organization for a completely different reason. It could be around social. If you have a sports and social club, for example, if you have a professional body in the locality that you're able to build some influence with, if you are, if you belong to a particular network within the organization. A lot of the very large organizations nowadays have, for example, diversity inclusive groups. They might have women-only groups, women in management, women in leadership. So I'm ethnic minority groups as well. So sometimes it's a long-term thing. It's not immediate. And if the most obvious route, as in influencing in your particular function or department or team, is not working, then I would go into an indirect route, which is actually finding people outside. Influence, as I hope that I was able to explain, isn't about seniority. It isn't about being junior, being senior, being top of the hierarchy. The key influences, if you look at key influences throughout organizations, they're in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be. But they are the people that people go to talk about things. So to be an influencer isn't just about your expertise, for example, in business analysis. It could be because you're known to be particularly empathic to situations, or you've had particular experience of particular situations where people will go to you and talk to you about them. So there are indirect ways of doing this, as well as the most obvious direct ways.
It's interesting. We've had it's more of a comment than a question come in just as you were answering that, Sarah, which is quite an interesting aspect as well. And again, I'll paraphrase because it's a fairly lengthy comment, but the suggestion is that in some situations, influence can be gained from sort of doing things outside the organisation, like perhaps writing papers or presenting at conferences, and that credibility helps when you're back in the organisation because people have seen that you've done it externally. I wonder what your view is on that. On sort of it sort of extends on, I think, your point about it being indirect. Would you consider that being a way of helping influence?
I certainly would, and thank you to the person who made that comment. You're absolutely right. If you, papers, blogs, chapters in books, if you get the opportunity to speak, not just at conferences and seminars, but perhaps at evening events for your professional body, that's the IIBA. In my case, it's the Association for Project Management. If you become a fellow of that area, of your professional body, a full member of that professional body, even putting yourself up for election to the board, becoming even, for example, a school governor, it all tends to imbibe you with a particular credibility and a particular value, and it demonstrates and evidences your abilities in particular areas and your trustworthiness as well, and especially your credibility. So, good point, very well made. Thank you.
Fantastic. And we just have one final question, which I've saved till last, which is, are there any additional books or resources that you'd recommend? So I know you've mentioned a few authors during the presentation, but are there any other resources that you'd recommend our listeners sort of read or download or buy?
I think that the ones that I found particularly useful are those that are actually in the presentation. So Robert Cialdini is one of my favourites. There's also a huge amount on, I love the internet. It's the biggest research library in the world. And I love it for the information, the esoteric to the sublime to the ridiculous that you can pick up on there. But there is another book which I haven't talked about, which I will give you in particular, and that's called Influencer, The Power to Change Anything. And these are not specifically any of these books to do with business analysis, but they are to do with how to change minds and how to motivate people and generate interest and generate critical mass to actually make change in any particular area of life, whether that's through your social club, your hobby, your football club, right through to healthcare. These are things that can work right across, and they work, typically they work at the individual level, which is going back to making changes in individual behavior and really being able to hook people onto what's important and why they should be interested in this at all.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And I mean, such a thought-provoking presentation. I have to say, one of the most common questions that's been asked is this session being recorded? And for anyone that's sitting there wondering that, it will be recorded and it will be on the IIBA UK website in a week or so. But I think that really shows the level of interest that we've had in this webinar. We had a huge number of registrations. So thank you very much, Sarah, for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Just before we close, could you just advance the slide, Sarah, to the final slide?
Absolutely.
So for anyone still on the line, if you have enjoyed the webinar, we'd really love it if you could perhaps attend a real-world event or indeed another webinar. If you're interested in finding out more about IIBA UK, do visit the website at www.iibauk.org. If you're not familiar with IIBA, we're an entirely volunteer run and led organisation in the UK, so it really is an organisation for business analysts by business analysts. So if you found this webinar interesting, you might like to look at the website, attend an event, you might even want to find out about volunteering or joining, so do take a look. And as a reminder, in a week or so the recording will be available for IIBA UK members. So all that's left for me to do is say thanks again to Sarah for a very interesting webinar, and finally to thank everyone who dialed in for attending. So have a fantastic evening, and thanks once again.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks.